development of bone and how our bone develops from the time that we are a fetus during the fetal period. So there are two types of bone development. One is called intramembranous ossification, which takes place within a connective tissue membrane. So the starting material is what differs between these two types. The other type is endochondral ossification, which takes place with hyaline cartilage. So if you look at just the terminology for each of these types of development, intramembranous means inside a membrane, endochondral means within cartilage. So chondra is that prefix that we said refers to cartilage. So it's very important for the test you understand the starting material for each of these types of ossification. But the ending material is bone that we cannot distinguish one from the other. Whether it developed from intramembranous ossification or endochondral, the bone is the same. So both types will produce woven bone that will be remodeled to form either compact or spongy bone. So we don't know by looking just at the ending material which type of ossification took place. So I'll go over each of these briefly, and there is a more detailed video afterward that kind of gives you a visual picture of these two processes. So intramembranous ossification is a process that forms the bones of the skull as well as the clavicle. So those are the bones formed by intramembranous ossification. And it starts out with, again, a connective tissue membrane in each of these areas, and there is an area in the center that starts to ossify. So think of this as a membrane that in the center begins to ossify. So the cells that begin this process are osteoblasts, and that forms starting from the center and working its way outward until these two membranes touch. And where those membranes touch will be the future sutures of the skulls that we see in the adult skull. But in babies, those are called fontanelles. They're soft spots between the connective membranes where that ossification, that hardening, has not finished. So there's several different bones that form the skull, so we can see the different regions here, ossification centers that begin in the center of each skull bone. The other type of ossification is endochondral ossification, and that is where we start off with a hyaline cartilage model. So this entire bone here is all hyaline cartilage. So it's chondroblasts that begin this process of making bone, not osteoblasts, as we saw with endochondral ossification. So the process starts with chondroblasts. So if we look at this first step here, a bone collar forms around the outside, which will shrink that cartilage in the center. And we can almost see it takes on the shape of a bone. It's a little wider on the ends and thinner in the middle. So this will be the future epiphyses, and this will be the diaphysis. So as that ossification center, or collar, sorry, the bone collar forms on the outside, we see ossification center form on the inside. And those chondroblasts become chondrocytes as it ossifies, and then they eventually increase in size and die because they're cut off from the nutrients due to this bone collar forming. So eventually that cartilage will be broken down and a cavity will form there. So here we can see a cavity forming inside of the cartilage as those chondrocytes died in the center of that cartilage as a result of that bone collar cutting them off from the nutrients. So then we have blood vessels invading this cavity, and those blood vessels will bring in blood cells such as osteoclasts, and osteoclasts will break down the spongy bone early here that might be formed early in the process of bone formation. So that maintains this medullary cavity. So osteoblasts can come in, build some spongy bone, and at the same time osteoclasts are cleaving that bone away in the medullary cavity. Then as we get closer to birth, you'll notice the time frame here. This is week 9 of fetal development. So week 9 is when this hyaline cartilage skeleton is beginning to ossify and turn to bone. So the 3rd month of pregnancy, 3rd month of gestation, is when we see this blood vessel entering, and the skeleton is being rapidly converted to bone. So osteoblasts enter here as well as osteoclasts, and that process of laying down bone and carving down bone continues here. And then at birth we see ossification centers forming in the epiphyses. So the only ossification center we see in endochondral ossification before birth is in the diaphysis. Then, after birth, we have secondary ossification centers forming in the epiphyses. And the same process occurs. We have a blood vessel that invades. It brings in osteoblasts and osteoclasts, except the difference is the osteoclasts do not break down the spongy bone. It's only osteoblasts that are working in the epiphyses. So osteoblasts and osteoclasts are signaled by factors within the bone to become active and perform their functions. So osteoclasts are not stimulated in the epiphyses of the secondary ossification centers. It's only osteoblasts building this spongy bone. And once that is complete, then all that's left of the hyaline cartilage is that space near the between the diaphysis and the epiphyses, and that's the epiphyseal plate. This is where the bone will continue to grow in length. And there's also hyaline cartilage that remains on the surface of the bone, which remains as articular cartilage. So remember, this bone started out as complete cartilage, and the only part of hyaline cartilage that remains at birth and into childhood is the articular cartilage. That'll stay there throughout life, even in the adult. And then the epiphyseal plate, which will remain there until this bone is done growing in length, which will be about age 21 for males and age 18 for females. So we see that on both sides of the bone, these remnants of hyaline cartilage at the epiphyseal plate and the articular cartilage. And again, osteoclasts are carving out this medullary cavity. Remember that that's filled with yellow marrow as adults, but prior to adulthood, there's red marrow in the medullary cavity as well as in the epiphyses. Is a disorder of the cartilage at the epiphyseal plates in humans. We see this also, a form of this in certain dog breeds like the wiener dog or the bulldog, but the cause of it is a different cause, but the result are short limbs. So in looking at this, this is also known as dwarfism. Achondral means no cartilage. So there is cartilage, but it's dysfunctional cartilage in the long bones that causes dwarfism. And this is from the television show Little People, Big World. And you can see that both parents have dwarfism. They have achondroplasia. They have 4 children, and only one of them is affected with dwarfism. So they really beat the odds, because the chance of having a child with dwarfism is actually 3 out of 4. So they only have a 1 out of 4 chance of having a child that's normal. And they had 4 children and had 3 out of 4 that were normal. So this is an autosomal dominant disorder, which means you only need 1 copy of the dwarf gene to have dwarfism. So the parents and their 1 son with dwarfism each have 1 copy, because we all have 2 copies of a gene based on our chromosome number being diploid, having 2 copies, one set of 1 from our mom, 1 from our dad. So these 3 people here that have dwarfism, they have 1 copy of the dwarfism gene, therefore they have dwarfism. But this baby here has 2 copies of the dwarfism gene. So this is called a double dwarf, and if you notice, the rib cage is very underdeveloped, so the lungs are unable to expand with that narrow chest cavity, and these babies often don't survive childbirth, or if they do, they only live a few weeks after birth. So chance of survival is essentially 0 for these children that have the double dwarf gene. So these children, these 3 children that do not have dwarfism, do not carry the dwarfism gene. That means when they go to have their own children, they don't have any inherited risk. Their children will have no inherited risk of dwarfism because they lack the gene, therefore they do not have the dwarf gene. So talking about how bones grow then, bones grow in length at the epiphyseal plate. So there's 2 types of bone growth that you should be familiar with, but appositional growth is where we're adding new bone on the surface, and that can occur in cartilage or bone. So we can have cartilage growing on the surface or bone growing on the surface, depending what the starting material is. So if we look at the epiphyseal plate, we see appositional growth occurring for both cartilage and bone. So how this process occurs is we have at the epiphyseal plate, we have the resting zone where we have just cartilage that's normally just maintaining, full of chondrocytes. And then we have the proliferation zone where we have active reproduction of cartilage cells and new cartilage being developed. And then we have the zone where the cartilage cells start to enlarge in size and die. And as they die, that matrix around them hardens, and blood vessels invade that cavity, bringing osteoblasts, and bone development begins. So we have at the epiphyseal plate, the top of the epiphyseal plate closest to the end of the bone has fresh cartilage, new cartilage developing, and the bottom of that plate has new bone forming. So the cartilage is not decreasing in size because it's growing on this side while it's being ossified on this side. So here we can see how it increases in length. Here's the plate prior to growth. Here's the plate after growth. So the plate simply moves upward. It doesn't change in its thickness, but there's more bone added underneath. So this bone is growing in length, but the size of the epiphyseal plate is not changing. The only time it's going to decrease in its width is when we near puberty and we have this ossification outpacing the increase in size or the proliferation of the cartilage on the top, till eventually we just have an epiphyseal line and there's no more cartilage remaining here in this region. It all becomes ossified. So looking at the different types of growth then, we talked about appositional growth is when we're adding bone on the outer surface of bone. Now that can occur also on the inside. Remember, the endosteum is what lines the medullary canal of our long bones. So appositional growth occurs on the outside, but if that continued to add to the outside, we'd have a very thick bone. So at the same time that we're adding bone to the surface on the periosteum, we have to be cleaving bone through osteoclast activity in the endosteum. That way that medullary canal increases in size proportionally to the increasing bone width. So it's important to understand that when we're growing, we have osteoblasts adding to the surface at the same time as we have osteoclasts cleaving out the medullary cavity. So those bones remain proportional. Some factors that affect bone growth that's important in our diet. Vitamin D is important for absorbing calcium into the intestines, so we already talked about that. Remember, vitamin D is starts its production in the presence of sunlight in our skin, then it travels to the liver and kidneys to be modified to its final form. And so if we don't have enough vitamin D in our diet, we can have poor bone development and soft bones because the calcium does not harden them sufficiently, because we need vitamin D to absorb calcium. And we also need vitamin C for good collagen synthesis. So it's important for us to get enough vitamin C. Like citrus fruits and colorful vegetables are rich sources of vitamin C. And they give our bones their flexibility. Remember, that's what the purpose of collagen is. So doctors recommend vitamin D, 800 milligrams of vitamin D to be taken with calcium to help us absorb enough calcium into our intestines and keep our bones strong. Other hormones that affect bone growth, a very important one is growth hormone. That is secreted in higher amounts at puberty from the anterior pituitary, and that's what causes the growth spurt that we see for boys and girls near puberty. The thyroid hormone is also important for growth of all tissues, and the sex hormones estrogen and testosterone are important for growth. We find that estrogen acts quicker on bone, so therefore girls start to grow taller sooner than boys do. But girls' growth is complete about age 18, where testosterone, even though it acts more slowly on bone, it acts longer on bone, and boys are not done growing in height typically till about age 18. Or I'm sorry, 21, age 21. And that is something that varies among the individual, of course. Some people have growth early in adolescence, and some grow later in adolescence. But generally, we can say 21 is the max age for men, and age 18 is the max age for women in height. So throughout life, we said our bones are remodeling. That means osteoclasts are breaking down the old bone and osteoblasts are building new bone. And this process, as long as it's balanced, will result in efficient remodeling. But as we age and our lifestyle, sometimes the osteoclasts can outpace the osteoblasts and we end up losing bone mass over time. And this is particularly true after menopause, when women stop secreting estrogen from their ovaries and they lose that osteoblast activity stimulated by estrogen. So when a bone is fractured, when it's broken, because all of the osteons inside that bone have a rich blood supply, remember they have blood vessels running through each osteon as well as between the osteons, and there's nerves running through the osteons, bone fractures hurt. And that's a classic symptom of a broken bone, is extreme pain and the inability to move the limb. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people just in daily living that have broken a wrist or broken an ankle or an arm or a finger, and the classic symptom of a break is the fact they cannot move it. With a sprain, they'll be able to move it. It'll hurt, but it won't be excruciating. But with a break, they will not be able to move that limb. Now, there's exceptions to that, of course. Some people have a high pain tolerance, but for the most part, the inability to move the affected limb is a sign of a fracture. So what happens is when we break through those osteons, those tiny blood vessels are ruptured and we see a leaking of blood into the bone and around the bone, which is called a hematoma. So you're going to see a lot of swelling, a lot of bruising around that site. That's the first sign of a break. Then over time, over not very long actually, maybe a matter of a couple of days, we start to see this fibrocartilaginous callus form that bridges that break. And that helps stabilize it a little bit, but it's not enough to prevent re-injury, so the bone should definitely be casted or immobilized during this time. And then those blood vessels bring in osteoblasts again, and that callus is converted to woven bone, which again is a fragile type of bone, which over time with more osteoblast activity we will see eventually solid spongy bone. So this would be an example. We're looking here, we're not seeing a medullary cavity, so this is not a long bone here. This might be, say, a fractured skull. So we see compact bone with spongy bone and then compact bone again. If you see this as kind of a side view of a skull bone, and that can happen when someone hits their head hard, a child sledding or snowboarding, skiing, car accidents, we can see fractured skulls, and this is what we would expect to see develop over time. So regardless if it's a long bone or a flat bone, we see the process of a hematoma forming first, then fibrocartilage callus. That callus is the key word to focus on here. Then the bony callus, and then true bone remodeling where we have osteoclasts cleaving away the old bone and osteoblasts building new bone, lining up with, again, the lines of stress.